So the focus here is on saddle point searches. And first of all, in the context of long timescale simulations, and then this sort of adaptive kinetic Monte Carlo, which I want to present and it is part of our collaborative, REAX Pro project. But then I want to also tell you about some of the newest and most exciting things, in my view, which is to use saddle point searches, very much the same algorithms, for finding excited electronic states. And this may comes as a surprise, but that's what we are doing now, and I think it's going to be very interesting in future development. Anyway, so I have my email address there, and so please feel free to email me, but also, during the presentation, feel free to interrupt me and ask me questions. So let's see. So I actually don't see my cursor here at all. I wonder how that works, but do you see my cursor? No.
Right now, I don't.
Is there a way to start a cursor here?
Let me check.
It's not so important, really.
I'm not seeing one right now.
No, okay. All right, doesn't matter, really. Okay, so anyway, so why find saddle points? Well, this is basically the way we can find mechanism and estimate the rate of atomic rearrangements, like chemical reactions, diffusion events, and things like that. And this can be, of course, this is typically within a classical description, that is, the atoms are treated as classical particles, but one can also extend this to quantum mechanical description, including tunneling. And then another thing is that one can also apply this to magnetic degrees of freedom. So one can be dealing here with the rotations of magnetic moments, and we're doing quite a bit of work on that. There are these interesting localized non-collinear magnetic states that can be possibly used for future high-density data storage and things like that, called skyrmions. And we are involved in estimating the lifetime of such states, again, because of thermal excitation. And then finally, I want to use the opportunity to talk about the calculations of excited states. So all of these things sort of are hinging on finding saddle points on energy surfaces. Now, let's start with the first thing, these long timescale events. And the key thing is to realize that typically, a chemical reaction or a diffusion event in condensed matter in solids, that is, are much, much slower than atomic vibrations. And this timescale difference is not emphasized ever too much, So let's take an example of an energy landscape here, where you have an energy barrier of, let's say, half an electron volt going from the initial state to some product state. And at room temperature, such an event can happen 1,000 times per second on average with a typical pre-exponential factor. So the lifetime of this initial state would be a millisecond. So it's really, really fast on a laboratory timescale. One has to be really quick to measure such a thing. However, on atomic, on the timescale of the atomic vibrations, it's a very, very rare event. And if you were to, for instance, make a movie of the atoms vibrating back and forth in this initial state, and give this the video, let's say, 1 second to describe, one vibrational period, you would have to watch that video for 100 years before you can expect to see a single one of these events. The time scale difference is so enormous that direct classical dynamics are of no use. And not only are would such a video be extremely boring, but it's completely useless, really. So the way to approach this has to be through some statistical approaches, which are well justified because the transitions are so rare. You actually do establish typically a Boltzmann distribution, and you can use statistical approaches to calculate the rates and find the mechanisms of the transitions. So just to emphasize that one shouldn't, in simulations of such events, assume the mechanism of the transition, because we have again and again be surprised by how the atoms rearrange. What is the mechanism? One shouldn't decide beforehand what mechanisms to explore. We should really have, methodology to let the computer simulation tell us what is the optimal mechanism. And the standard example that I like to present always in this context is the diffusion of an aluminum atom on an aluminum 100 surface. One might think, and I think everybody assumed, that the atom would simply hop from one side to another, which is showed here in the upper graph. The yellow atom is the atom, and it's hopping from one side to another. But Peter Feldman, from using DFT calculations already in 1990, found that there was another mechanism that has a significantly lower activation energy barrier, namely the sort of two-atom concerted displacement. So the atom moves into the surface layer, and the surface atom moves out. And it was actually demonstrated experimentally with STM images later for platinum atom on a platinum surface. And so this kind of a concerted displacement can also involve more atoms, and I show here to the right displacements where 4 atoms are moving simultaneously, or 5 atoms. They're also fairly low in energy. So it's an example of where the preconceived mechanism is just not correct. And if one does calculations only using the preconceived mechanism and it's wrong, well, we'll get wrong results. So
that is very interesting, actually. So may I just coin in a question on that?
Absolutely.
So basically, the mechanism is not always as it seems, especially now in this case you are presenting. How does that put, let's say, these tools into perspective, where usually, let's say for NAB, you use some sort of initial estimate on how to place the beats, which can be, for example, with us, it's usually some linear interpolation or some independent pair potential, I think was the name, IDPP, as an estimate. And so this may prevent you from finding the right result if you're not careful.
Absolutely, absolutely. This is absolutely right. Because, for instance, in this case, even though all aluminum atoms here are equal, atom A and atom B are different. And in an NEB calculation, for instance, the final state here is different. In the sort of the hopping mechanism, it's atom A that ends up being the atom in the final state. But in the exchange mechanism, it's atom B that ends up being in the atom in the final state. So these final states are different because we have to label the atoms, and numerate them 1, 2, 3, 4, and so forth. So if you do an NEB calculation, you will, and assuming that it's going to hop, the simpler mechanism, you will just get the hopping mechanism. Yeah, you're absolutely right. So this is an example where the NEB calculations are likely going to give you the wrong results. I mean, the NEB simply converges onto the minimum energy path that's closest to the initial guess.
Right.
So you're absolutely right. This is an example where, you would get the wrong results basically with an NEB calculation, assuming the final state of the hopping atom. And it doesn't really matter whether you do a straight line interpolation or an IDPP interpolation. By specifying the final state, you really have already biased the calculation, and it's unlikely that any minimization would really do that, Okay? So I'm going to talk about a different method, that is more powerful than NEB. Okay, here's another example. This is related to crystal growth, where a key issue is what happens to an atom that lands on top of an island. Is it able to get down to the growing layer, or is it going to end up nucleating, a new island on top of the island, thereby, promoting three-dimensional growth rather than layer-by-layer growth? And so here we've done a lot of calculations on these kinds of things, for instance, on platinum crystal growth. And we find, for instance, that there are downstepping events near, but not at kink sites. And it's shown here in it's shown here in C, the inset C. And it's really counterintuitive, that this two-atom concerted exchange mechanism occurs there close to, but not at the kink site. And it means also that the final state energy, you see the dashed line there, the one that the path with the lowest activation energy actually leads to a final state energy that's higher in energy than if you were, filling the kink site. And so again, it shows that the energy barriers, they don't scale with the final state energy. It's not, this Brunstad-Evans-Polanyi, rule that, of course, doesn't apply to transitions involving different types of transition states. So it's just another example of a non-intuitive mechanism that really is very important. I mean, this kind of a downstepping event near but not at a kink site can actually explain experimental observations of the so-called re-entrant layer-by-layer growth. Anyway, so I'm not going to get into that much here, but it's just a wake-up call. One should not assume the mechanism of these transitions. We really have to have simulation tools that can tell us without preconceived notion what is the optimal mechanism of transitions. Okay, so that's my point, right? These kinds of unexpected mechanisms are more and more being called Rumsfeld processes. This is referring to a famous statement made by the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, but it was really used before, that the unknown unknowns is what is scary. Unknown unknowns are risks that come from situations that are so unexpected that they would not be considered. It was what he stated, and unfortunate, at that time of some unfortunate decisions, actually. But really, this is the key. We don't know what are the unknowns that we need to look for. There are these unknown unknowns that can really completely change the way system will evolve, and we should be careful about these kinds of things in our simulations. Okay, now the work that I'm going to talk about here is all within respect of solids, so where we can actually apply harmonic approximation to transition state theory. That I'm not talking about liquids. I'm talking about solids where the atoms are vibrating about well-defined positions or average positions, and going from one state to another, we're essentially going over energy rich, and the saddle point is essentially the mountain pass that has the highest statistical weight. And by doing a second order expansion of the energy surface, first at the minimum, initial state minimum, and then at the second order saddle point, one can derive the harmonic approximation to transition state theory, which is given there. The activation energy is the saddle point energy minus the energy at the minimum, initial state minimum, and the pre-exponential factor is related to the vibrational frequencies at the saddle point within the dividing surface and at the initial state minimum. And this works fine for solids and surface or solids at not too high temperature. So this is the focus then, is to basically, in order to find what is going to happen in the system, we need to find these saddle points on the energy rim that is surrounding the initial state minimum. And essentially, one is making the approximation here that the transition state is sort of a mosaic of hyperplanar segments, each segment going through a first order saddle point with orientation, with the normal basically pointing along the eigenvector of the negative eigenvalue, basically the unstable mode. That is the approximation that we're going to be working with here. And so the key issue then becomes, given an initial state, labeled R here in the graph to the right, what are the low-lying saddle points? One basically wants to find all the low-lying saddle points without preconceived notion of the product states. Here are 5 different product states illustrated. There typically are many more, actually, but we're particularly interested in the low-lying saddle points because those represent the most likely transition mechanisms. Okay, so as you mentioned, Thomas, there is this NEB method. It assumes you know the final state, but that is already projecting a pretty strong constraint on what you will find. So a more powerful thing is this one-point problem, B here, where only the initial state minimum is known and specified. It's a more difficult problem. It requires more computational effort, and but can be done, and that's what I'm going to present. This,
Can I just
yeah?
come back to the previous slide? So you write there that harmonic TST is 3 orders of magnitude faster than full transition state theory. Could you elaborate on that?
Yes, sure. So the one can also simulate. One can also calculate full transition state theory, where you actually have to find the free energy of the dividing surface and compare that with the free energy of the initial state, and that can be done by one can have these hyperplanar segments and move them gradually from the initial state minimum to the transition state, and optimize the transition state to find basically the maximum free energy. But every position of the, let's say, hyperplanar segment requires evaluation of a thermal average. So that takes about 1,000 force energy and force evaluation to calculate the thermal average. So here, we don't need to do a thermal average. We can move on the energy surface, and so essentially, in going away from harmonic transition state theory to full transition state theory, you have to replace one evaluation of the energy and the force with a thermal average, which takes at least 1,000. Something. Yeah. Just a hand waving argument like that. Okay.
Yeah, makes sense.
Right. So anyway, I definitely want to talk about. I'm not going to talk about the NEB method here. I want to talk about this more difficult problem of finding saddle points around a given initial state minimum without preconceived notion of the final state. So it's a one-point problem, and that can be used as a basis of long timescale simulation. I mean, NEB cannot really be used as a basis of a long timescale simulation, because you have already decided what's going to happen in the system, essentially. But if you don't specify the final state and just find all the relevant low-lying saddle points, that can be the basis for a long timescale simulation of the system. And so, again, showing here some energy surface. There's this initial state minimum there with yellow, and then you have 4 different saddle points there, and essentially the task is to find these saddle points. And of course, in general, you have many more saddle points, and in general, you have an enormous number of saddle points. But remember, we're only interested in the low-lying ones that that can easily be overcome from thermal activation. So what's so hard about saddle points? We know there are all kinds of methods for finding local minima. So at least if you're given some initial guess for the arrangement of the atoms, for instance, you can relax and you can minimize down to the nearest local minimum. Now, the hard thing about the saddle point is that if you look at the force acting on the atoms, some of the, let's say, at the saddle point, if you go to the neighborhood of a saddle point, in some cases the force is directing you to the saddle point. In other cases, in the along the x direction, the forces are directing you away from the saddle point. If you are dealing with a first-order saddle point, that is the Hessian matrix, the matrix of second derivatives has just one negative eigenvalue, then there is one direction for which you need to maximize the energy while you minimize the energy with respect to all other degrees of freedom. And the hard part about finding this first-order saddle point is that typically you don't know what is this 1 degree of freedom for which you need to maximize the energy. And the key thing is really to find that direction, and then you can simultaneously be maximizing along one direction and minimizing with respect to all other directions. And this special direction is, of course, the eigenvector corresponding to the negative eigenvalue. So once you are out of the basin around the minimum where all the eigenvalues are positive, and you go into a region where at least one, if not more, eigenvalues are negative, you want to find that the eigenvector corresponds to the lowest eigenvalue. And you might think, well, that's enormously difficult. because you just, first of all, constructing the Hessian matrix, the matrix of all second derivatives, that alone is going to be an enormous calculation for a sizable system. But and then finding the eigenvalues and eigenvectors is again an enormous calculation. But the thing is that there are several ways in which one can find this minimum mode, that is the eigenvector corresponding to the lowest eigenvalue. And if you can do that, then all you need to do is to take the force acting on all the atoms in the system, written here as F of I, and then you basically project the force onto that minimum mode. That's the F dot V, and then you multiply by V again, and you subtract twice that component. So what you've done is you reversed the direction of the force along this minimum mode direction. And then you transformed the force field around the saddle point, the first order saddle point, from what is being shown here above to the one that's below. And the one that's below is, all these red arrows there, they're all pointing towards the first order saddle point. Whereas before, some of them are pointing away. So now you can basically take this effective force, Fi effective, and stick it into whatever minimization routine you like for finding local minima, and you will instead converge onto a first order saddle point. So this is the key trick. We call this minimum mode following, and we published this in a long time ago, 1999. The key thing here is that you don't need to evaluate the Hessian matrix and the eigenvalue problem. You can just focus on the minimum mode. And how do you find the minimum mode? There are many ways of doing that. What we came up with was this sort of a dimer method. You have to make two replicas of the system, keep them at a certain distance, and then you just rotate the dimer and ask, what is the lowest energy orientation of that dimer? The lowest energy orientation is indeed when you are lining the dimer along the minimum mode. But one can also use Lanczos. That's an iterative method for finding essentially eigenvalues and eigenvectors. It converges first on the extrema, so the lowest and the highest actually. But then there's the Davidson method. It's even better because it's preconditioned to converge fastest on the lowest eigenvalue and eigenvector. So as you do the iterative calculations, you first converge onto the lowest mode, and then the second lowest, and so forth. And you don't need the higher ones.
And the focus of this has then been, of course, periodic DFT calculations.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Because otherwise, let's say in Gaussian for small molecules, you can ask for the Hessian in an efficient way.
Yeah, absolutely. That's right. So I mean, and there, people often, in fact, for small molecules, and let's say Hartree-Fock or techniques where the second derivatives are available analytically, yes, you can just calculate the Hessian matrix and diagonalize. It's no problem. Here we are focusing on larger systems where that diagonalization is going to be too expensive, or condensed matter, plane wave DFT calculations where you just don't have the second derivatives. You really want to work with first derivatives only. Yeah, very good point. Yeah. Exactly. Right. So here's shown to the right as a sort of a schematic. This is a contour plot of the energy surface there shown to the left. And so what's being shown here is that one makes some random displacement from the initial state minimum. In the green curve, you make a little random displacement to the left, and then one can start climbing up the energy surface with this projected effective force, and you converge onto saddle point 4. And then you make another random displacement to the red curve, a little bit to the right, and you converge onto saddle point 2. Then you make a third random displacement there with this purple curve, and it takes a roundabout way and goes way up in energy, and then comes back down and converges onto saddle point 1. So that's the idea. You're climbing up the energy surface, starting with some different, we have to do some sampling here of random displacements and try to sample saddle point around the minimum. Now you might immediately object and say, well, how do you know whether you found all the relevant saddle points? And there's no guarantee. Just like when you're doing a minimization and you find local minima, you never know whether you found the global minimum, right? The global optimization is extremely difficult for sure. And it's certainly never going to be easier to find saddle points than local minima. And so it's never going to be easier to find the lowest lying saddle point than finding the global minimum, right? It's always a problem of sampling and somehow sampling enough until you believe that you've seen enough, but there's no guarantee.
So basically you try to sample this multi-dimensional space, of course, and then
Yes.
you don't know whether you caught all the directions, right? Because there's also it's not a straight mode or so. There can be, as you show, also these curves or so, or paths which bend then.
Right. It isn't going to be so straight as indicated here. In this two-dimensional calculation, these are actually calculations.
Yeah.
So there's always a nagging problem. Have you found everything that you should find? But at least you're not projecting a preconceived notion of what you should find. So, and it's a matter of sampling enough. So then we have some test problems where we just really killed it in a sense that we really worked very hard to find all the saddle points, and then we can sort of check and see, well, how many energy and force evaluations do we need to find all the relevant saddle points? There's a sort of a website with benchmarks that we developed to try to test these things, But yeah, now I should also mention, just in passing, that we are actually trying to work on a more systematic method. And it is part of the REACT Pro project to try to find more deterministic and systematic ways to go from a minimum to a saddle point. But that's something that's really just in the works now. I'll give you a talk about that next year. Okay.
Okay, sounds great.
Okay. Now, so here's again an illustration of this. So let's say we start out at this local minimum there with the blue, contour lines, and there's this big green X there illustrating where the minimum is. Make a random displacement. Of course, the displacement shouldn't be sort of, completely random in a sense. So here's a little bit of a preconceived, thing. Perhaps, let's say if you're dealing with a surface, you're interested in the reaction of some molecules on the surface, you would displace those atoms preferably. Or if you're looking at a defect, the migration of a defect, you displace, let's say, the atoms around that defect. So perhaps you put a center and displace all atoms in a spherical region around that center, something like that. So of course there is going to be perhaps some preconceived notion as to which atoms are going to be moving, because of course in doing, let's say, a calculation of a periodic system, of course not all the atoms are moving, right? If all the atoms are moving, your system is too small, right? We are typically looking for local transitions where only a few of the atoms are moving significantly, and most of the atoms are not, or they may just be slightly, sort of, shifting back and forth or something like that. But really the transition involves only a subset of the atoms in the system. Okay, and then you climb up. To begin with, we actually do not use the sideways relaxation, rather just push the system along the minimum mode. And when you're in the convex region where all the eigenvalues are positive, and then once you get one negative eigenvalue, switch to including downward relaxation in the perpendicular degrees of freedom. And so that's a reason for this kink there in the green curve as you approach saddle point 3. And then at saddle point 3, you find what is the unstable mode, of course, and then you push the system slightly and slide down on the other side, and then you discover what product state does this transition correspond to. And then you can evaluate the rate from harmonic transition state theory. You got the energy of the saddle point, you compare it with the energy of the initial state minimum. You do calculate the Hessian matrix there at this point. Perhaps you calculate the Hessian matrix only for a subset of the atoms, having the rest frozen, and that's typically a good approximation actually. And then you get a rate. and now you do other displacements, and you find a rate for other saddle points. Normalize this into the rates, the relative rates, and then you can have a random number to pick what's going to happen next. So then you get a kinetic Monte Carlo simulation, which is different from the normal kinetic Monte Carlo simulations in that you don't have a table beforehand. You don't construct beforehand the table of all possible events in the system, but rather here in atom 1 and 2, that's shown in red, you actually are you're generating the table of possible events and finding the rates from the saddle point searches. And then after you found sufficient, what you believe is sufficient number of saddle points, you can do the usual kinetic Monte Carlo thing, pick a random number, choose a transition, advance the system to the new product state, and estimate the time that would have elapsed if you were to do real dynamics. The advantage here is that you don't need to make a lattice. Otherwise in kinetic Monte Carlo you have to make some kind of a lattice to be able to enumerate the possible transitions. Here you don't need to do that. So you can apply this to amorphous materials or random, disordered materials. You don't really have to project onto a lattice.
So if you don't numerate your states or your minima which you have found, how do you prevent from going back, or is that just part of this evolution in itself?
You can, so you can certainly go back, but you have to remember. You have to, you remember all the states you visited. That's not so difficult,
Okay, so you have some bookkeeping in there, and then you basically know where you have been, and you can reuse the previous.
Exactly.
Results.
That's right. And not only, and perhaps. You come back to the same state, but perhaps something changed in the system further away, so you can start with the old saddle point and just now refine it because something changed in the system, And so definitely you want to have this bookkeeping of all the states that you've been to and all the saddle points you found, and then you can refine them and so forth. And so there are many, of course, tricks to this. Let's see. So I accidentally went backwards here. Yeah, so we have this, software for doing this. We call it EON, which means enormously long time, and for us, 1 second is an enormously long time, right? On the time, compare the time scale of atomic vibrations.
Yeah, that's an eternity indeed.
So the way this works is that you can farm out these saddle point searches. I mean, you don't even have to have parallel algorithm. You do it in a distributed way, because some saddle point searches take longer than others. You don't need to synchronize these things. You can just, the server simply farms out these saddle point searches and collects information until, typically, if you've seen the low-lying saddle points again and again sufficiently often, you say, most likely we've seen what there is to see. And then a decision is made as to what happens in the system next. But there are many tricks to this which are built into EON, and some of them are, for instance, systematic coarse graining. I mentioned that in the next slide. But there's this recycling that I mentioned. You remember all the old saddle points and you use them as a initial guess, because this kind of a saddle point search doesn't have to start near the minimum. It can start, very close to an old saddle point. You can start anywhere on the energy surface and charge ahead, go up the energy surface onto a saddle point. So you could be starting somewhere in the neighborhood, which in the neighborhood of a saddle point, which was a saddle point in a previous configuration of the system. Then there is also the possibility that two paths, they can end up going to the same saddle point. And that's a bummer, of course, because you're wasting quite a bit of computer time. And so you want to identify that, and that's the skipping path. Then you want to, we found that it's efficient to generate sort of a hypersphere and generate the starting point, as being opposite and as far away on this hypersphere as possible, so as to minimize the occurrences of converging onto the same saddle point again. One can use the initial state Hessian, because we're going to calculate a rate anyway, so we need to get the Hessian at the initial state minimum. we might as well do that right away, and then we can use that to in the preconditioning of the saddle point search. There are all kinds of tricks.
So that's basically to determine the prefactor then effectively for the rate, right?
No, okay, yeah, right. You do need to calculate the Hessian at the initial state minimum in order to calculate the rate, the prefactor. That's right. But now, and since you're going to have to do that anyway, you might as well do the calculation of the Hessian right away, and then as you are climbing, starting from the vicinity of the initial state minimum, you have a good guess for what the Hessian looks like, and that you can use to improve the preconditioner in the Davidson algorithm. Okay. So
that's also what you use then probably to switch between. So before you said in the first couple of steps you make along the projected direction, and only afterwards you switch in the traversal forces then?
Well, yeah, but actually you don't. Okay, yeah, you of course just all the time, you're calculating the minimum. Sorry, the minimum mode and the lowest eigenvalue, and you just see from that, where you get the negative eigenvalue. That's when you switch. As soon as you get the negative eigenvalue.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, but anyway, the thing is that a preconditioner helps you find that lowest eigenvalue and corresponding mode, and the preconditioner is essentially an estimate of the Hessian. If you have an estimate of the Hessian. So for instance, the way Davidson is used in electron structure calculations, you use the kinetic energy as the diagonal estimate of the Hessian. Anyway, okay.
Yeah.
There are all kinds of tricks to try to make this more efficient. And, we came up with this method already 20 years ago, and it hasn't been used very much, really. And partly that reason is that it's so expensive to use this with electronic structure calculations. But now we can see that this is starting to become a possibility. And so I think the time is right now to start really using this more, because before we just didn't have so many potential energy surfaces that one could use in this kind of calculation. But now one can actually start doing this with DFT. But it's very important to make this as efficient as possible. And one of the things is coarse graining, because even in a simple, kinetic Monte Carlo simulation, you have this problem that there is a huge disparity of rates. I mean, for instance, here is shown water molecule diffusing on an ice surface. It's this proton-disordered ice surface, so no two sides are the same. And you can see there are some rates here that are 10 to the -7, and some are on the order of 1. And so there's enormous disparity. And so if you have these fast transitions, they can eat up all your CPU time, even if you're not doing any calculations of saddle points, just a regular kinetic Monte Carlo. And so there's this systematic coarse graining. You bring together local minima that are separated by small barriers, call that one state, and stop, trying to resolve the dynamics within that coarse grained state, and eventually, you push out out of that. Another thing that we're doing is using machine learning to come up with an approximate energy surface. And now this is shown here in the context of an NEB calculation, but the same thing for the saddle point searches. You use whatever calculations you've done with DFT or whatever electron structure calculation you're using to come up with a surrogate model that is an approximate energy surface. You find the saddle point on that energy surface, and then only do new calculations where you believe they're most important, refine the surface, and so forth. And in the end, of course, you converge onto the true saddle point. And that's actually shown here, and it was published a couple of years ago, where we could show that you can save an order of magnitude in the number of, let's say, electron structure calculations to converge onto a saddle point. And this is also part of the REACS Pro project. Anyway, so just to show here briefly some simulations. So we applied this to crystal growth and grain boundaries and solids and all kinds of things. But I'm just going to show here diffusion of a water molecule on the proton-disordered ice surface. because it's proton disordered, this is like an amorphous surface in some sense. No two sides are the same. And the atoms actually, the molecules are binding in non-crystallographic sites. And again, I'm showing this slide here with the different rates. Here's an overview of the different kinds of sites. I'm just going to go through this very quickly. This was a collaboration with Herma Kupen and her student Kasmeyer a few years ago. There are actually some tendencies for the dangling protons to line up on the ice surface. They call the Fletcher surface. So I'm showing here sort of a histogram of states, binding energy of different sites on the surface, both on the Fletcher ordered surface and the proton-disordered surface. You can see the enormous range of binding energies there. And then similarly, of course, there's an enormous range of energy barriers involved and so forth. And then we can do the simulation of the dynamics with the AKMC method and extract the diffusion coefficient. So I'm just going through this very quickly. The surface is not frozen here, and we can see, in fact, that there are these transitions that occur in the surface as the molecule, as we're simulating the diffusion. And here's a transition involving 4 water molecules that were rotating in a concerted way, moving a dangling proton that's shown with this little light blue dot there on one of the blue dangling atoms, and it moves quite a bit, this is just showing that, it's hard to guess these kinds of transitions beforehand, right? This is something you can just see from this saddle point. So there's a single saddle point to flip these molecules in this way. And the surface initially was there, there's a blue line drawn between adjacent dangling hydrogen bonds. And you can see that after the simulation, there's less clustering of the dangling hydrogen bonds. So this is again going towards the Fletcher surface, where the repulsive interaction of the dipoles of dangling hydrogen bonds is being reduced. Anyway, an ongoing project here is with Alejandro, some of you may know, because he's working on the REAX Pro project. And this is using a REAX FF potential from AMS. So we couple EONT with AMS. And we're looking at the oxidation of platinum surface, which is relevant to, for instance, fuel cells. There's some indication that the efficiency of the platinum nanoparticles is reduced after a certain amount of time, because there's some oxidation even on platinum under these conditions where oxygen molecules are being formed in the oxygen evolution reaction. And we're looking here at the kink site, because those are the active sites. Kink sites are the active sites for growth as well as desorption, and those are the ones that give you the highest binding energy for the oxygen atoms. And we can see here that the surface is being roughed up. So we're showing here a calculation where the energy as a function of the the state that is found. And you can see there's a lot of this flipping back and forth. And then there's this coarse graining involving, let's say, 160 states. And finally, then the system is able to escape out of that. And you can see that the ordering of the platinum atoms at the kink is being roughened up. It's no longer fitting onto the lattice, that you have for the pure platinum surface. The oxygen atoms are really, roughening up the surface. And so this is
inserting themselves in the top layer then basically, and
lift
that atom up.
And you can see how it's lifting up some of the platinum atoms there, and you're starting to form an oxide, So it's not just oxygen atoms sitting on the surface, but really burrowing in. And so so that can be seen in the AKMC. It would be very hard to do this in a regular kinetic Monte Carlo, where everything has to be mapped onto a lattice. Anyway, so that's an ongoing project, and and this is also sort of illustrating how this works. You the system may be sort of yo-yoing back and forth between similar sites and with low barriers in between, but then in the end that's coarse grained, and boom, then there's some interesting event where something major is happening as the energy drops significantly, So this is typical. We've seen the same kind of behavior in annealing of grain boundaries and things like that, All right, but anyway, so yeah, okay, I've actually used up all my time, but basically I want to sort of demonstrate to you how simulations of long time scale evolution, of course, necessarily in small systems. I mean, you can't really be dealing with thousands or tens of thousands of atoms, but rather a few hundred. But these kinds of simulations can give you an idea what kind of transition mechanisms are involved, and then transfer that to a regular kinetic Monte Carlo simulation, which is more coarse-grained, where you only put in the relevant transitions, and then you can simulate larger systems over longer time. So this is part of the REACS Pro thing. You learn from an AKMC simulation, then put that into a KMC, which in the REACS Pro is given by Sacros, the Sacros software. And so this is one of the things that Alejandro and Nestor have been working on, is to deliver these things to the KMC in Sacros, And anyway, look, so I don't really have any time now, but I wanted to tell you about the saddle point searches. Now, when you think about the electronic degrees of freedom, so saddle points on the energy surface as a function of the electronic degrees of freedom, that is the expansion coefficients of the wave function in terms of, let's say, atomic basis set or something like that. They are actually saddle points. They are, so one can use here saddle points to find these things. I'm not going to go through this because I'm out of time, but basically here's the idea. If you're dealing with a HOMO to LUMO transition, the energy surface or this excitation basically is corresponding to a first order saddle point. There's one way for the system to relax back to the ground state. If you're going from the HOMO to LUMO plus 1, then you're actually dealing with a second order saddle point and so forth. So one has to deal here with higher order saddle points, but the same method can be used, as I showed before, to basically transform the derivative of the energy with respect to the electronic degrees of freedom, so as to converge onto excited states in a Kohn-Sam formulation or Hartree-Fock, if like. Okay, so we just have published recently a paper on this in J. Kempf's letters, where we're twisting the ethene molecule, but let me just not go through this. I'm out of time. But it's very important here. I believe this is going to be very transformative in the sense that people will have, I think, stop doing time-dependent DFT calculations pretty soon, because they are really not very accurate, and they are problematic. For instance, for seeing the interesting, significant charge transfer excitations, high-lying excited states, Rydberg states, all of that is very hard to find in a typical time-dependent DFT within the linear response formulation. The thing is that the calculation I'm talking about, finding saddle points, they are variational. You actually get to a stationary point, and you optimize the orbitals. You're not dragging along the orbitals from the ground state calculation. And so, and there's a beautiful paper by Head Gordon, actually, where they looked at an electron transfer reaction, rather a strange one. But you can they show here how sensitive the excitation energy is to the functional use if you do a time-dependent DFT calculation. Whereas if you do a variational calculation here in a delta SCF calculation, you get very much the same results for different functionals. It's a much more robust calculation. Anyway, yeah, so I'm just going to flash this a little bit here. We've got excellent results here on calculations of excited states using this saddle point approach. Okay, so let me just finally thank my coworkers. Alejandro Peña-Torres is the postdoc working on the platinum oxidation and has been working on the REACS Pro project, coupling EON to AMS and coupling EON to Sacros. The initial machine learning Gaussian process regression work was done by a student, Olli-Pekka Kostinen, in Aalto University, where I was guest professor. And that has been now rewritten in C++ Rohit Goswami, who's here and sitting by the table behind me, Rohit Goswami. And that's almost ready. That is, well, it's still being refined, actually, but that's going to be a much faster implementation of this GPR surrogate model approach. Some of the work that I showed here was being done also by Ville Ásgeirsson, who's there in the front. This was taken when he had graduated. And Alexei Ivanov is the person that has, and Gianluca Levi, as well as Elvar Jónsson, are the people who have been working on the electronic structure calculations, calculating excited states, with and without self-interaction correction. And so here's the list of funding. So let me just thank you for your attention. Sorry, I didn't really have time to talk about the electronic excited states much. I just want to mention that briefly. Okay.
Yeah, it's a very, very interesting point also to see how that goes then, or which direction this can take then. It's rather surprising. Yeah, maybe I can just follow up on that with a brief question. So when you are able to define some saddle points in an electronic structure space, basically population numbers, right? You can then also, of course, couple that with nuclear degrees of freedom, I assume?
Yes, absolutely.
So that is the main point. And then you should be able also to calculate things like in all the dye materials or so, the transitions between excited states there, where you have some mode coupling between vibrational and nuclear degrees of freedom.
Yeah, the idea is to be able to do surface hopping and switching from one energy surface to another, and pushing here as far as we can, essentially a single determinant description. That's of course that's perhaps something that one might question, because we know that there are multi-reference effects, right?
Exactly.
But here's an example, where we calculate the conical intersection of two of the excited states, well, of the ground state and one of the excited states, and you can see that while linear response time-dependent DFT gives you qualitatively wrong description, even with hybrid functionals, we can, with simply a PBE functional, a generous gradient approximation, get a very good description of the conical intersection compared with multi-reference CISD calculation. And the key thing here is really symmetry breaking. You have to allow, if you really are going to push a single determinant description, you have to allow for symmetry breaking.
Yeah.
But by doing that, you can get amazingly far. So that's what we're pushing, because it's cheaper, and that will allow us to do dynamics and calculate curve crossing and hopping between surfaces. Right.
And do you also have plans to extend this to, let's say, superconductor research or so, where you also have likewise some couplings between electrons?
We don't have a plan for that. But what we're working on is this defect in diamond, the nitrogen vacancy charge defect in diamond, and we're calculating excited states there and want to see the decoherence dynamics. Basically, that's what we're interested in, is figuring out what is the decoherence dynamics, and also for chromophores in solution, and how decoherence and energy transfer occurs from excited states to ground state. What is it that determines the lifetime of these excited states? I think that's what we're basically going to be focusing on.
I see.
Yeah. But any good suggestions would be great. We're sort of have this tool here, and are very much looking forward to applying this to different things. Here, I'm flashing here a paper we published last year, where we did a fairly large system, looking at transition in a photo sensitizer, and so these are definitely the kinds of things that we can do with this method.
Yeah, indeed, that would be interesting also for the OLED modeling. So we had some projects with SCM and a couple of partners in Netherlands as well.
Yeah.
And well, part of this is, so besides getting the structure right of these layers and everything, it is also of course very crucial to get the transition rates in there between multiple different excited states during the decay path. And yeah, so this looks also very interesting with that in that regard, I would say.
Yeah. So I didn't mention that, you know, what we have implemented this excited state calculations in the so-called, you know, GPAW software, you know, grid DAW code. But we would be very interested in working with you guys on implementing this methodology in your software, you know, for sure.
Yeah,
and
sounds definitely like a discussion to be continued.
Okay.
I can imagine there is plenty of interest on our side on this too, indeed. So this looks actually very, very interesting for a multitude of different applications.
Yeah.
As far as I can see that. Maybe some last question regarding these functionals and their respective performance in there. It's maybe less a question than a comment. So because so usually you say, okay, this functional, it gives you a given transition state with a certain accuracy, and then you use something else. You hope that the potential energy surface you get with that different method, it roughly matches up. In which case you basically can distinguish between the functional, so the pure description of the electronic structure, and the method or algorithm you use to find a transition state or to manipulate your system, right? And in that case, so if I understand this correctly, you start basically mixing these two aspects a little bit. So in the sense of when you preset then some given electronic configuration, can you then still say this very functional gives good results and this one not? And is that still would that still be possible in the sense of because you're not really looking at some, let's say, what is the minimum, and DFT being a ground state theory, of course.
I'm not sure I get the point. Sorry. Yeah, could you?
So if I understand this correctly, you look at the transition in the population space or electronic structure space, right? So you look at single excitations, and you basically say then that this is going to be a triplet state, or it's going to be a singlet state, or something like that.
Yes, that's true.
And so then just to basically to say linear. Okay, we have a question actually. No, to say then that linear response theory, because that of course it's linear, right? And then it of course depends on the functional in the sense of how does it represent the excited states, and is the functional giving you the right, let's say, localization and things like that.
Right, and it becomes very sensitive to, you know, for instance, I mean, in linear response time-dependent DFT, you know, the energy, the excitation energy, is very much reflection of your homo-lumo gap, or let's say the orbital energies, right? And so you know, LDA gives you horrible, you know, orbital energies, right? Homo-lumo gap, for instance, being way too small, and then finally, if you add the right amount of exact exchange, you start to get reasonable, you know, orbital energies, you know, and so
you start localizing things a bit more, like you start localizing the frontier orbitals, for example, and thus you get this. Right. Partially, it's an error compensation, right? That's also part of this whole discussion, of course, because half of these good results for the good functional for the excitations you don't get for the right reason, right? You get that because there's some error compensation.
Absolutely, that's right. I mean, these hybrid functionals are just cooking. You know, you're taking two approximate descriptions that happen to have errors of opposite sign, and therefore by adjusting the linear combination of these two descriptions, you can get a good result. But it's getting the right answer for the wrong reason, essentially.
Exactly.
Absolutely right.
But indeed, so that maybe that's the best angle to explain the comment a little bit, because you also have, for let's say, one part of the reason why LDA or GGA to some extent works so well for, let's say, metallic systems is that there is this delocalization error, which basically mimics some multi-reference effects.
Yeah.
In these. Again, for the wrong reason, but it gives you acceptably good results. So then my question would be, so if you then start enforcing the populations and start enforcing the electronic structure by looking at the different, considering them as different states, essentially, how much are you then interfering with this delocalization error or error cancellation in some sense?
So are you thinking here about this, where we
this was the slide.
Where we decide, what order saddle point we're looking for.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's right. So we have to be careful here because, I mean, as we move along, the ordering of these states may be changing, right? And we saw that, in fact, I don't have it here, but nitrobenzene, we did calculations of nitrobenzene, where in fact the ordering of the states was changing, and the order of the saddle point we're looking for actually changed on the fly. So I think that's a very good point, and surely there's a lot we need to learn here. But then another thing I wanted to perhaps mention, and I wonder if I have it here. I don't have it, which is that we apply self-interaction correction. And so that's shown there. So that can be important, especially when you're comparing two different energy surfaces, because the self-interaction may be different for different energy surfaces. And you can see here that without the self-interaction correction, we get these greenish dots. But with the self-interaction correction, we get the blue dots there, and then the black solid curve is the multi-reference result. So these are absolutely mind-blowingly good results from a single reference calculation. But self-interaction correction can be very important, and that's another thing that we worked on a lot, and would be very happy to share with you our efficient algorithms for implementing the self-interaction correction. Which I believe is a more, it's getting the right answer for a little bit closer to the right reason, but it's essentially giving you very similar effects as mixing in hybrids or exact exchange and hybrid, but you are, really attacking the root of the problem in a more focused way.
Yeah, similarly, you could also do this with DFT plus U, for example, if you know which orbitals this happens. And
but then again, that's in my view, semi-empirical, right? Even though people keep talking about that as first principles calculations, I think it's better. One should really. I'm amazed how uninterested people are in this direct self-interaction correction, because it is a more sensible way, an understandable way to get to the root of the problem.
Yeah, so from my own time as PhD student, where I was actually looking at these kind of problems, for self-interaction and delocalization, and then it's a little bit on, usually when you do these kind of things, then you improve one aspect, but you really sacrifice on others. Like in my case, I was looking at some absorption energies or so, and then you get the right ordering of the energetics of the absorption side, but then you also at the end of the day the quantitative accuracy goes very much down, or becomes practically useless at some point.
With self-interaction correction.
With DFT plus U in that case.
DFT plus U. Yeah, right.
Yeah, but it's usually there is no free lunch, I would say, for this kind of methods.
Yeah. No, I don't think the U is a good way to go. So now I need to learn more about your work. So where were you? Sorry, I don't know. Where were you?
In Munich, but it was mostly my project or out of my project. So where we looked at basically implementing hybrid functionals and what can they be used for in a group which predominantly looks at metallic surfaces.
Yeah.
And
so you were with Karsten or?
No, I was with Professor Rush in the same.
Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right.
And
yeah. Well, I think you did look at self-interaction correction, you say. So how did you implement that? That's a big question, sort of, because many implementations of self-interaction correction are perturbative and not variational, not self-consistent.
Yeah, I mean, this Purdue-Zunger basically evaluates individual orbital densities.
That's right. That's what we're using here, the Purdue-Zunger. But it's tricky to do that in a self-consistent manner because you go outside of CONSAM. It's no longer CONSAM because now you have explicit orbital density dependence.
Yeah, which you do already when you have hybrid DFT, for example, or even meter GJs in a formal sense.
No, well, not really. The hybrid functionals are still unitary invariant.
But you need some optimized effective potential to make that really to write the potential as a derivative with respect to the electron density, right? That is the whole the connection. So we basically were treating these things as usual meter GGA functionals are treated, that you just add this as a term to the Hamiltonian and then do the SCF and hopefully it converges as one does with normal hybrid DFT methods, right? By default, you do not use optimized effective potentials, so it would make it much more costly.
That's so expensive. Yeah, that's so expensive. Yeah. Okay. Well, look, I think I would very much like to chat with you more about this, but perhaps that's
likewise. We have, however, another question from from Bin. He was asking for if you could comment on the biased potential for simulating long timescale events.
The bias potential.
Yeah, if you use anything like that, or.
Yes. Okay. So I guess the idea is to use something like the group Muller bias potential. You can, let's say, if you want to just get your system to move out of a given state, okay, then you could start having a Gaussian or some kind of a repulsive potential just to push the system out, right? Is that the idea? But there's there's of course an elegant formulation of that called hyperdynamics that Art Woter has developed, and the key thing is, however, that you need to make sure that the bias potential doesn't contaminate your saddle points. So the bias potential has to shut off when you get close to the saddle points, and certainly those can be you can. Yeah, well, it's difficult to construct such a bias potential actually, and of course the calculations are enormously more complicated and take longer time, because again that's a matter of doing thermodynamic averaging. You have to, let's say, if you grow your bias potential, you have to do sampling and calculate averages. So it's a lot more expensive than these saddle point sources. The saddle point sources I'm talking about here, they would take typically, let's say, for surface reactions or diffusion, things like that. You're talking about, let's say, 300 energy and force evaluations. So while an NEB calculation is on the order of 100, but then of course you have to do many. So again, if you compare that with doing, some kind of a thermodynamic averaging, it's a lot faster, So this kind of climbing up on the energy surface is a lot faster than doing any kind of averaging, thermodynamic averaging.
Exactly.
So, but of course, if you're getting into a liquid, you cannot be doing these saddle point searches. Then you have so many different saddle points, and the energy landscape is rough. And so then you're forced to do some kind of thermodynamic averaging for sure. And so I think in that context, yes, these kinds of bias potentials are the best thing we have now, right? But if you're dealing with a solid and reactions on the surface of a solid, harmonic transition state theory is typically good enough for low temperature. Then these kinds of approaches are quite a lot more, faster.
We have some more question. Theo asks, to which extent can one apply the minimum mode following to locate transition states in biological system? So for example, transformation of substrates in the active centers in enzymes, where concerted reactions, of course, often play an important role because they have lower barriers, I guess.
Yeah. Well, that's an excellent question. I really have no idea. I mean, I've never really worked on any biological systems, but one would be worried here in that the biological systems may have a much more complicated energy landscape, more like a liquid in some sense. We have a whole bunch of saddle points and so forth. However, the active sites often are fairly strained and perhaps so I tell you what, I was once at a conference, at CCAM conference, where people were sort of talking about this more, transition path sampling and things like that, and saying, well, for any big system and any complex system, you can't really, focus on saddle points. You can't really, you really have to do something much more complicated. And then Martin Karpler stood up and did showed some calculations of enzymatic reactions and simulation of active sites, and he just calculated saddle points, and he got fantastic results, and he got the Nobel Prize, by the way.
Yeah.
so I think people often underestimate, they try to sort of write off, transition state theory. They write off harmonic transition state theory and say, oh, you can't really apply this in complex systems. I think in many cases, people really just haven't tried it and don't really, but it's clear that if you have a rough landscape and that roughness is important, then, you can't really use saddle points. But I think for the active sites, if you're really looking at the transition, at the actives, and you forget about all the different, configurations that the more remote atoms can have, then you can apply this, I think. I mean, apparently, Karpler did and got very good results.
This is also, actually, given that all the pharmaceutical modeling industry or so keeps usually the active center in some proteins fixed, probably that sounds like a good guess to assume, right? And
then of course also some QMMM approach is worth doing, and that's definitely So if one focuses on the QM region as being fairly confined and sort of well-defined transitions there, but do some thermal averaging over the MM region, I think that could be done.
Yeah. And maybe while we're at that, and also something which Rosa, for example, was recently concerned with. So if you would apply this for, let's say, let's say you don't use this as a system for reaction, but you use this as for systems where you apply the constraint that all the bonds are kept in place, and then you end up with looking at different conformers and internal rotations around bonds. So how much would that work in your estimate?
Well, I don't know, but I mean, I think it should be also possible. I mean, what we are doing here in this ice simulation is actually we're actually fixing. These are frozen, water molecules. In a sense, this is like a conformational search. I think that can be useful. But I really don't know. I think that should be fine. It's a matter of sort of what is the energy landscape like? You know, is it all full of small ripples? You know, meaning that you have thousands of saddle points. Then of course it's going to be very, very difficult. Or you have a few important saddle points. So that ends up being the question. You know.
Yeah, it depends, of course, on the system very much, right? But in general, you have, of course, a few kilocalorie barriers of barrier height, and you have a lot of them, of course. Lots of different minima. But maybe also because we were talking about this before, so to which extent you can sample this properly, right? Or like all of these theories in principle assume some sort of smooth analytical surfaces, right?
Yeah. Oh yes.
And, so of course then there comes the ugly aspect of reality. So when you switch on the DFT program, you have to use some grids. When you use ReXFF, you also get some kind of numerical noise, and likewise you do with tight binding and so on. So, have you ever looked into some kind of correction schemes for this, for some noisy potential energy surfaces? So,
yeah, we've thought about this, but no, we really haven't done anything, you know. But that is a very, very important thing. Yeah, we, as I said, we are using ReXFF here for this oxygen on platinum, and I was very nervous about that actually because. I was sort of expecting that we would have a lot of little bumps and even discontinuities. But Alejandro tells me that he isn't seeing that actually. So this ReXFF potential seems to be good enough actually. Yeah. But I tell you what, we at one point we wanted to use so-called modified EAM potential for platinum because we're very interested in platinum growth, you know, and Vasquez, you know, sort of developed this modified EAM where he took into account the d electrons and the directional bonding of the d electrons. And man, that energy surface was terrible because it had all these little ripples, you know.
I can imagine.
And then we talked to him about that actually, and then he said, yeah, well, this comes very much from having very short range cutoff functions, you know, for bonding. And that's done to make things cheaper, right? But I think these kinds of energy surfaces, they should be using smoother and longer range switching functions. That would help a lot, you know.
Yeah.
And so that is one thing. But then of course one can think of just do some kind of averaging, or one can say, you know, if you converse onto a saddle point, you can ask afterwards, is this just a little ripple? If so, then, you know, you just move on. But it's going to be wasteful. It's going to be wasteful, you know, if you have many little ripples. You can, in principle, deal with it, but it's going to cost a lot, you know. So, no, that's a tough problem, right? And in a sense, you know, that's also what sort of stopped us. But I think the DFT has typically a very smooth surface, especially if you do it with plane waves, you know.
That helps a little bit, yes. But there is still a grid involved, right? At some point. So
there is a grid, yes, true. But you know, the K-space grid is a lot more forgiving than the real space grid. And so,
but no, I mean for like numerical integration over the exchange correlation term, that there you need a grid typically, and that adds noise no matter how you set that up. And you can use a Cartesian grid for periodic systems, of course. Usually it's better if you use something atom-centered, and but that comes at a price, of course, as everything.
The use of the machine learning to generate this surrogate surface may actually be useful in this respect too. That the machine learned surface is going to be smoother. Let's say if you even if you start with noisy electron structure data, you can make that surrogate surface smooth, you know, smoother, you know. So
if you use something like smooth activation functions. That's because some in this community, they have also like very kinky and functions in use. So like what is it? rectified linear activation functions or so, for example.
Okay, is that a neural network approaches?
That is a neural network, and
Yeah,
then
right.
for these nodes, you can use different activation functions, and usually you use something very smooth, but some are also indeed using just some 2-segment linear functions, which then one has a slope of 0 and the other one has a parameterized slope then. And
yeah, I think the neural network potentials can indeed have more sort of problematic shape, but we're using Gaussian process regression here, which is biasing things very much towards smoothness, actually, perhaps too much, actually, in a sense that there's a certain length scale defined, hyperparameter. So I think the the Gaussian process regression actually tends to give you very smooth surfaces, but it's slower. It's a lot slower than neural networks. And it's a challenge to apply that to a truly large system. Right.
Good. Yeah, Rosa, do you have any
I
comments?
could ask a quick question.
We talked about a lot of different things.
I'm just curious about the timings. So if you can give an idea of because you showed very impressive simulations with Ion, or with adaptive kinetic Monte Carlo. Can you give me an idea of like the timing that it takes for, but also in relation to the number of minima that were found?
Right. So a typical, saddle point search requires, let's say, on the order of, let's say, 200, 300, 400 energy and force evaluations, typically, I mean, just to give you an idea. So, and then, you have to multiply that by the number of saddle point searches you carry out. And so indeed, this is quite, enormous, right? Using some kind of surrogate model approach to reduce that is good, but this takes a lot of iterations, which is why it's hard to use this in the context of electronic structure, but it's starting to become possible. So here's this OptBench, benchmark website that Graham Henkelman, a former student of mine, and David Wales have set up, and it gives a lot of timings for MEB and timer or minimum mode following calculations, and for different systems like this heptamer island on a surface and things like that. So I think that could give you an idea of these things, how many and how many energy and force evaluations basically are needed. It is.
It does. Thank you.
Yeah. Does that answer your question, Rosa? Okay. All right. But it certainly is big calculations. But one of the nice things about these saddle point searches is that you can easily make use of a lot of cores, right? And so imagine that if we have 1,000 cores, we can really
and I think so. In fact, like you said before, like even compared to biased MD, you are going to you're kind of much more directional. You focus more on the small paths that you want to take. So you have less noise in your path, so you're probably faster indeed. So
yeah, I mean, right, because if you're doing dynamics, you're always going to be having to go back and forth, and do some 1,000 steps to average. Whereas here you can, move more in a directed way. Yeah. So as long as you can live within the harmonic approximation of transition state theory, it's going to be faster.
Thank you.
Right. Okay.
Good. I think we have had a long conversation, which I think is a very good sign. Also, this is accidentally some format we always wanted to try out. So this fireside chat, more like we never, we never got it together. But yeah, I think that's pretty much how it turned out today.
Okay, very good.
Yeah, let me thank you very, very much for showing these results and answering all the questions.
Okay.
And with that, I think I would then like to conclude the session.